She was the first woman executed in Texas in over 135 years, a defining moment in a case that captivated the nation. Karla Tucker's crime was so gruesome, it shocked even hardened investigators. But as her final hours approached, the world watched a woman transformed, raising questions about redemption, justice, and mercy.
I have no fear of that, and I don't worry about myself, but I certainly am concerned for those who are going to be left behind.
What led to her ultimate reckoning, and what were her final moments like? Early life. Born on November 18, 1959, in Houston, Texas, Karla's early years were full of dysfunction and instability. She was the youngest of 3 daughters, but her parents' tumultuous marriage left a huge impact on her childhood. By the time she was 10 years old, her parents had divorced, fracturing what little stability her life had known. From a young age, Karla's world was saturated with influences that would later shape her troubled past. Her mother, Carolyn, had a reputation for being a free spirit, and she often exposed her daughters to the adult world of partying and substance use. This environment left little room for the innocence of childhood. Karla's relationship with her father was equally strained and distant, leaving her with a deep sense of abandonment and a yearning for acceptance. As a child, she was described as bright and outgoing, but these qualities were overshadowed by the chaos in her home. By the time Karla was in her early teens, she was accompanying her mother to bars, witnessing the effects of substance abuse firsthand. This early exposure to substances and alcohol was not incidental. It was formative. The school became another area of instability. Karla's performance in the classroom was inconsistent, and she eventually dropped out by the age of 14. Without the structure of school or a supportive home environment, she found herself drifting toward a life that offered immediate escape but long-term consequences. Her mother's death, when Karla was just 16 years old, became another turning point. Carolyn had succumbed to complications related to substance abuse, and her passing left Karla adrift with no anchor to guide her. As a result, Karla became enmeshed in the world of biker gangs, where drugs and violence were part of the culture. This lifestyle offered her a sense of belonging that she had long craved, but at a devastating cost. Her introduction to hard substances was not an accident, but a natural progression in the circles she moved in. Methamphetamine, in particular, became a cornerstone of her existence. The substance's euphoric highs masked the pain and emptiness she felt, but it also dulled her sense of morality. Friends described her during this period as both vibrant and reckless, someone who lived for the moment with little thought of the consequences. The social circles Karla moved in were a dangerous mix of adrenaline and lawlessness. She became involved with individuals who shared her addiction and her penchant for living on the edge. One of these figures was Daniel Garrett, a fellow addict who would later become her accomplice in the infamous murders. Their relationship was volatile, fueled by their shared addictions and an escalating need for thrill-seeking behavior. What began as a search for belonging soon became an all-consuming lifestyle of drugs, danger, and lawlessness. The vibrant, outgoing child had given way to a hardened, volatile young woman whose choices were driven by desperation and a need to numb the pain of her reality. The crimes. By the time Karla Faye Tucker reached her early 20s, her life was defined by chaos. Substance abuse, criminal behavior, and toxic relationships were no longer fleeting episodes. They had become her reality. The bikers she surrounded herself with weren't just friends, they were her chosen family, a community bound together by a shared rejection of societal norms and a dangerous thirst for adrenaline. For Karla, this lifestyle offered an escape from the pain of her past, but it also dragged her further into a spiral of self-destruction. Among the most pivotal figures in her life was Daniel Garrett. Garrett was a man deeply entrenched in the biker subculture, someone who shared Karla's penchant for hard drugs and reckless living. Their connection was immediate but toxic, a relationship forged in addiction and fueled by mutual recklessness. Garrett wasn't just her partner. He was her co-conspirator in a life of lawlessness. Together, they pushed boundaries, blurring the lines between thrill-seeking and outright danger. Their drug-fueled bond only deepened their descent into darkness. Methamphetamine became a central force in their lives, warping their perceptions and amplifying their paranoia. It was within this haze of addiction that their paths crossed with Jerry Lynn Dean, a mechanic whose dealings with the couple turned contentious. What began as petty disputes over a motorcycle escalated into a boiling resentment. The tipping point came in June 1983. Karla and Garrett's resentment toward Dean had reached a breaking point, and their drug-fueled paranoia transformed simmering anger into a reckless plan for confrontation. On the night of the murders, the pair stormed into Jerry Dean's Houston apartment under the guise of reclaiming the motorcycle parts Karla believed were rightfully hers. Fueled by a dangerous cocktail of methamphetamine and rage, they weren't just seeking revenge. They were unleashing the chaos that had been building inside them for years. Inside the apartment, the situation spiraled out of control. Dean was attacked in his sleep, with Garrett delivering the first blows using a hammer. Karla joined in, seizing a pickaxe to strike him repeatedly. The scene was brutal, a manifestation of their unchecked anger and addiction-fueled detachment from reality. But the violence didn't stop there. Deborah Thornton, a woman who happened to be staying at the apartment that night, became an unexpected victim. She had no connection to the dispute. She was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. When she attempted to hide, Karla and Garrett found her. Despite her pleas for mercy, she was attacked with the same pickaxe. The brutality of the crime shocked even those familiar with the violent tendencies of the biker world. The aftermath of the murders was as disturbing as the crime itself. For Karla Faye Tucker and Daniel Garrett, the immediate response wasn't panic or remorse. It was a strange mixture of exhilaration and nonchalance. In the days following the brutal murders of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton, Karla openly boasted about the events to friends. She described feeling a rush of pleasure during the attack, even going so far as to say she experienced a sense of satisfaction with each swing of the pickaxe. Their attempts to cover their tracks were minimal at best. There was no carefully orchestrated plan to erase evidence or avoid suspicion. Instead, they continued their drug-fueled lifestyle as though nothing had happened. This carelessness, combined with Karla's willingness to recount the events in graphic detail to those around her, set the stage for their inevitable downfall. The police investigation unfolded quickly. Law enforcement received tips from individuals within Karla and Daniel's circle, people who had heard their shocking confessions firsthand. Witness accounts, coupled with forensic evidence from the crime scene, painted a clear picture of what had transpired. The brutality of the attack, combined with the sheer recklessness of Karla and Daniel's behavior afterward, left little room for doubt. Within weeks, the pair was arrested and charged with capital murder. As Karla sat in custody, her earlier bravado began to wane. For the first time, she was forced to confront the full weight of her actions. But even then, her initial reactions were marked by defiance rather than remorse. She admitted to the murders without hesitation, describing them in stark, unflinching terms that shocked investigators. This brutal honesty, while undeniably powerful, only served to solidify the public's perception of her as a cold-blooded killer. Karla's reflections on the murders evolved over time, revealing a stark contrast between the person she was at the time of the crime and the person she would later become. In the early stages of her incarceration, she spoke of the murders with an unsettling detachment. The thrill she described feeling during the act was a chilling reminder of the depths to which her life had sunk. Yet, as the years passed, this narrative began to shift. She would later express profound regret for her actions, describing the murders as a turning point that forced her to confront the pain and chaos that had defined her life. Trial and convictions. As Karla awaited trial, the public's interest with her case continued to grow. The sheer brutality of the murders, combined with her candid admissions, made for a sensational story that captured headlines across the nation. The prosecution's portrayal of Karla as a remorseless killer and the defense's attempt to humanize her by highlighting the factors that had shaped her life became a factor. The prosecution leaned heavily on the details of the crime. They presented evidence of the attack's savagery, including the infamous pickaxe that had been used as a weapon. Witness testimonies from those who had heard Karla's confessions added further weight to their case, painting her as someone who not only committed a horrific act but reveled in it. Her own words, spoken with disturbing candor, became some of the most damning evidence against her. The defense faced an uphill battle. They argued that Karla's actions were the product of years of trauma, addiction, and toxic relationships. They emphasized her drug use at the time of the crime, suggesting that her state of mind was severely impaired. While these arguments provided important context, they did little to sway the jury in the face of such overwhelming evidence. Key moments from the trial highlighted the tension between these two narratives. The graphic descriptions of the murders left the courtroom stunned, while the defense's attempts to elicit sympathy for Karla were met with skepticism. In the end, Karla Faye Tucker was convicted of capital murder and sentenced to death. The decision was met with a mix of relief and controversy. For some, it was a fitting punishment for a crime of such brutality. For others, it marked the beginning of a larger conversation about justice, redemption, and the human capacity for change. Karla Faye Tucker entered death row as a woman the world saw only through the lens of her brutal crimes. Convicted of the grisly murders of Jerry Dean and Deborah Thornton, she was labeled a remorseless killer. But behind the prison walls, a transformation was quietly beginning, one that would ultimately redefine her legacy. At first, Karla's demeanor remained much the same. She was defiant, unapologetic, and resigned to her fate. The weight of a death sentence loomed over her, but she seemed almost indifferent, as though she had already accepted the inevitability of her punishment. For many, her lack of visible remorse reinforced their perception of her as irredeemable. But in the solitude of her cell, Karla began to reflect on the path that had brought her here. The drugs, the violence, the emptiness, it all seemed so distant, yet so deeply woven into her identity. One of the most profound shifts in Karla's journey was her embrace of Christianity. She credited her newfound faith as the catalyst for her transformation, describing how it gave her a sense of purpose and hope that she had never experienced before. Karla immersed herself in the teachings of the Bible, finding solace in its messages of forgiveness and redemption. For someone who had spent much of her life in chaos, the structure and discipline of faith were grounding. She began to pray daily, not just for herself, but for those she had wronged. Her prayers extended to the families of her victims, whom she hoped could one day find healing. Her faith wasn't confined to private moments. Karla became an active participant in prison ministries, offering counsel and support to fellow inmates. She wrote letters filled with words of encouragement, sharing her story in the hope that it might deter others from making the same mistakes she had. Karla's faith radiated outward, touching the lives of those around her. Guards, inmates, and even members of the public who learned of her story spoke of her sincerity. To many, she became a living testament to the power of redemption, a stark contrast to the person she had been at the time of her crimes. Karla also took on the role of a mentor within the prison. She offered support to other inmates, helping them navigate the emotional and spiritual challenges of incarceration. Through her actions, she fostered a sense of community in an environment defined by isolation and fear. Her remorse for her crimes was a constant theme in her writings and conversations. She didn't shy away from the reality of what she had done, nor did she attempt to excuse it. Instead, she acknowledged her actions with brutal honesty, emphasizing her desire to atone. Karla even reached out to the families of her victims, expressing her profound regret and praying for their healing. Though she knew she could never undo the pain she had caused, she hoped her efforts would bring some measure of comfort. As news of Karla's transformation spread, it sparked widespread public interest and debate. To her supporters, she was a symbol of the human capacity for change, a woman who had found redemption in the face of unimaginable odds. Religious leaders, including prominent figures like televangelist Pat Robertson, rallied to her defense, citing her faith and remorse as evidence that she deserved clemency. Even Pope John Paul II appealed on her behalf, asking for her death sentence to be commuted to life imprisonment. But not everyone was convinced. To her critics, Karla's transformation was seen as a convenient attempt to escape justice. They argued that no amount of faith or good deeds could erase the horror of her crimes. For them, her newfound persona was overshadowed by the memory of the brutal murders she had committed. The last 24 hours. On February 1998, the 38-year-old convicted murderer was transferred from her cell at the Mountain View unit in Gatesville, Texas. Her journey to the Huntsville unit, the oldest prison in Texas, was her final one. This facility, known for housing the state's execution chamber, had seen hundreds of executions since it opened in 1849. Karla was scheduled to face lethal injection the following day. Once at Huntsville, Karla was placed in a small holding cell near the execution chamber. She barely slept that night, clinging to a faint hope that some last-minute miracle might spare her life. She had spent years appealing her conviction, citing issues like ineffective legal representation and the influence of drugs on her actions, but her efforts had all been unsuccessful. Deep down, she seemed to understand. that her time was running out. On the morning of February 3rd, Karla woke at 6 a.m. Unlike many prisoners on death row, she declined the standard breakfast but nibbled on some crackers and sipped a soft drink. The morning hours were spent visiting with her family, including her father, sister, and husband, Dana Brown. Dana, a prison minister who had helped Karla find faith and later married her by proxy in 1995, was among her closest supporters. Their time together was bittersweet, separated by a screen that prevented any physical contact. Despite her efforts to remain composed, Karla was brought to tears during these emotional moments. Later in the day, Karla was moved to the death house, a cell located just 30 feet from the execution chamber. There, devastating news arrived. The U.S. Supreme Court and the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals had rejected her final legal appeals. It was clear that no reprieve would come. Even so, Karla maintained her faith and spent time with her spiritual advisor. For her last meal, she requested a banana, peaches, and a tossed salad with ranch dressing. However, she barely touched the food. By the late afternoon, the reality of what was to come settled over the prison. Karla declined the offer of a sedative, choosing instead to face her fate with clarity. Around 6 p.m., she took a shower and changed into a fresh white prison uniform and shoes. Her hair, still damp, was a reminder of her simple humanity in what was otherwise a highly scrutinized and somber event. At 6:05 p.m., Karla was escorted the short distance to the execution chamber. The atmosphere inside was heavy with emotion. 5 people she had chosen to be there: her sister, her husband, a close friend, her attorney, and Ronald Carlson, the brother of one of her victims, sat among the witnesses. Carlson, unlike many others, believed in Karla's transformation and opposed the death penalty. In a separate room, family members of her other victim, Deborah Thornton, observed the proceedings, their emotions a mixture of grief, anger, and a desire for closure. Meanwhile, outside the prison, over 1,200 people gathered. Some protested against the death penalty, while others supported it. The case had drawn significant public attention, partly because Karla was the first woman to face execution in Texas since 1863. Before the execution began, Karla was given the chance to speak. She turned first to the families of her victims, saying, "I am so sorry. I hope God will give you peace with this." Then she looked at her husband and softly said, "Baby, I love you." She also spoke to Ronald Carlson, asking him to hug his sister Peggy for her. Turning to the rest of her supporters, Karla expressed her gratitude, concluding with words of appreciation for the prison staff and a promise to wait for her loved ones in heaven. The sincerity in her tone moved many of those present, even as the reality of her crimes lingered in their minds. At 6:37 p.m., the execution process began. A series of drugs was administered. First, a sedative to render her unconscious, followed by a muscle relaxant to paralyze her, and finally, potassium chloride to stop her heart. Karla closed her eyes and began to hum softly, her voice faintly audible as she praised Jesus in her final moments. The room was silent except for the sound of her breathing slowing. Moments later, Karla coughed, groaned, and became still. At 6:45 p.m., she was pronounced dead. Witnesses noted that she appeared to die with a faint smile on her face, a sign of the peace she claimed to have found in her faith. Karla Faye Tucker's execution was historic. As the first woman executed in Texas in over 135 years, Karla Faye Tucker's life and death left a lasting impact, raising questions about the nature of redemption and the human capacity for change.